Welcome back to this little series of 3 videos we're doing on the popular diets in the United States. And remember, we looked last time at the most popular, which was intermittent fasting. And then the next 2 down were low-carb keto. All right, what is a low-carb keto? Is it healthy? What does it do medically for us? How did we get to this place in the first place? This looks at carbohydrates. So we were eating in the 70s, a little 220, about 1980. All of a sudden, our carbohydrates went up drastically from the late 70s to the early 90s here. This is fat and protein. They stayed the same the whole time. What did this? What did it do to us? Well, I think what it did, 1980, we created the food guide pyramid. At the bottom of the base, eat carbs. And so people just did it. They started eating more carbs. But that was a bit problematic for the next reason. As we started eating more carbs, so this is the amount of carbs. So we were eating less carbs from 1909 down to about 1960. Something happened there. We started eating a little bit more. And then in 1980, something happened. We ate a whole lot more. Well, in the 60s, was when Ansel Keys came in and said fat was causing heart disease, eat more carbs. So we started that in the 60s. Well, we did. We started eating more carbs. And then in 1980, with the food guide pyramid, ate a lot more carbs. Herein is the problem. These lines show this is total dietary carbohydrate in the dots. This is carbohydrates from fiber. What happened? We're eating more carbohydrates, but the fiber isn't there. We were eating refined carbohydrates. Yeah, we didn't say that very well in 1980 when we started this whole thing. What did we create? We created Snackwell, the Snackwell Phenomenon. Food companies rushed to make these low-fat versions of what we thought of as healthy food, and we replaced butter with margarine and trans fat, another very bad idea. Vegetable oils were promoted as healthy, which turned out to be pro-inflammatory, and we ended up making Snackwells. Do you remember that? I do. I remember on the low-fat diet, I was really into that back in the 80s. And so after the food guide pyramid, I ate Snackwells. I fed them to my children. That little box had maybe 9 in it. And each one had its own little chair because it was just no fat. It would just break into dust if you hit it. And so we had these lovely little cookies, and I fed them to my kids thinking, these are good. There's no fat. But I knew at the time, what are they made of? White flour and white sugar. Well, we knew that was bad, yeah, but it wasn't as bad as fat. Boy, were we wrong. We've got some more videos about that. We'll show you that in a minute if you want to go back to those. So since this happened in 1975, also with this whole high carb craze, Atkins came out with his book on low carb diet in 75. This is studies. Studies started happening on the low carb diet about 2000. They really started happening, and about 800 studies by 2020. So it just keeps going up. These are clinical trials. Again, it's not 800, it's 100. But about that same time, at 75, they started. In about 2000, they really started. And we have all of this amazing research on the low carb diet. There was a battle for 20, 30 years between low fat and low carb diets. But what is a low carb diet? First, a low carb diet is pretty much the same. Most people, very low carb diet is 20 to 50 grams or less than 10% of energy. That is a ketogenic low carb, very low carb diet. And then a low carb diet is less than 130 grams or less than 26% of the calories. Okay, that's not no carbs. If you look at this 13 grams and assume that 1 serving of fruit is 10, that's 13 servings of fruit. Okay, so we're cutting down, but we're not cutting down to nothing. Most people are up at maybe 40, 45, 45, 50. So here's another one, the same, less than 50 is ketogenic, 10%. 51 to 130 is 10 to 25%. And then a moderate carb is up to 45%. Which is what the American standard is right now. You should eat 45 to 55. A little bit more than that is what the diet recommendations say. And so here's where we are. Many people think when you hear low carb, I can't eat any carbs. That's not true. On these low carb diets, I think I eat pretty low carb, but I don't know what I am. I'm probably up at 80, 100 grams a day, up to the top end of what this shows as low carb. Low carb does all kinds of things, but we're not going to be able to talk about all of them except a little bit of weight management. We'll talk about a little bit of diabetes and a little bit of heart disease. But it does things for non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, epilepsy. It's amazing what it does. Even sports nutrition, it can be very effective. But we're just going to talk about first is weight reduction. And so the initial concern about these low carb, high fat diets is that fat is 9 calories per gram, carbs are 4 calories per gram. You're going to eat fat and you're going to get fat. That's what we said. Well, that didn't turn out to be exactly right. When you eat fat, you get happy and you get full. And so what it does, fat slows down your stomach emptying. It increases some hormones for satiety, dietary proteins, short-chain fatty acids, the free fatty acids increase the GLP-1, which is again, satiety. These branch-chain amino acids in proteins reduce appetite and ketones. Oh, the ketones we've talked about, such as beta-hydroxybutyrate, suppress appetite. So we were so wrong thinking we can't have a lot of fat because fat's going to make us fat. And what it did, fat makes us happy and satiated. Not only that, but the low carb diet. So this is in the dark blue is the low carb diet. And this is looking at hunger. After 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 weeks, what happened with the low carb diet here compared to the low fat diet in light blue, the hunger went down. So you were less hungry on the low carb, high fat diet. Something else happened too. This is the dark line again, and this is looking at carbohydrate preference. The longer that you were on this low carb, high fat diet, your preference for carbs diminished. And so you didn't crave them as much as you did before. I've seen that. If I don't eat an Oreo for like 10 years, I don't think about it. But if I eat an Oreo, then I want 10. And so my cravings come back with the sugar. Now, some studies about weight loss. This is a study from 2014, and it's talking about low carb versus low fat diets. This is people 30 to 45 kilograms per meter squared, so their BMI is high. 30 means overweight. Some of these people are overweight to obese. And the low carb diet is less than 40. So what is that? Now that's down in the ketogenic range. This is a keto diet compared to the low fat diet. What did they find? Well, my students over the past 20 years, about 2000, 2005, I'd send them out, compare Atkins to Ornish, the keto diet, the low carb diet to the low fat diet. And they'd come back to me and say, the low carb diet won. I said, that's impossible because the low fat diet is the answer for America. And after about 5 years of this, I finally said, okay, fine. They kept bringing me all this data, and this is all over the place. When you had the low carb diet, people lost about 5.3 kilograms, about 10 pounds. The low fat diet was half of that, less than half of that. In the low carb diet, you lost 1.2 kilograms of fat. That's what we're after, losing fat. The low fat diet, only 0.3 gain in fat mass. So here you're losing fat. In this low fat diet, you're gaining a little fat. And then this is gain of lean mass. Wow, you can be on a diet and you can lose just fat and you can maintain and build your muscle. Yes. What happens in a low fat diet? You end up losing muscle as well as fat. And so loss in lean body mass. This is 8 years old now, but we've been seeing this over the past 15 years or more, that low carb diets seem to be better for weight loss. This is a low carb diet versus low fat diet. It's a meta-analysis of many studies. It's 11 different studies. These are controlled trials, the best, the gold standard. 6 months, 1,000 people comparing low carb diet, less than 20% of energy. This is not really ketogenic. It is just talking about low carb. And so what did we find here then? The participants on the low carb diet had a weight loss of 2 kilograms. That's about 5 pounds more than the low fat diet. Triacylglycerol, fat, went down in the blood. They had a greater increase in HDL and LDL. Now we think of LDL as the bad, HDL as the good. When you're on this low carb diet, both of them go up, but they go up in the same amount. The ratio is the same. And so it actually improves your ratio between HDL and LDL. And then this is a study looking at Atkins, the main low carb diet, Zone, which is a lower carb diet, Learn, Ornish. And what they found here, Atkins is in blue and the other ones on the top. So looking at weight change, all of them had some weight loss. But if you compare that to Atkins, Atkins had significantly more than some of these diets. So there's plenty of information out there about weight loss on these low carb diets. But the second thing I want to talk about briefly is more than weight loss. It's good for type 2 diabetes. It's good for heart disease. And what this shows, and this is the control in the dark blue now. And in the light blue is this low carb diet. After 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, something else was going down besides weight. And this is hemoglobin A1C. It's the long-term marker for blood glucose and for diabetes. And all of a sudden now, 10, 15, 20 years ago, we started seeing that not only did it work for weight loss, but it also worked for diabetes. Type 2 diabetes, 52% of the population is diabetic or pre-diabetic. So who are we talking about here? Almost everybody. Here's a recent meta-analysis then. This is looking at safety of the low-carb diet for remission. What? Remission of type 2 diabetes? That means you can actually get rid of it? That's fairly new in the last 10 years or so. We never thought that 20, 30, 40 years ago. If you got diabetes, you had diabetes. Not so. So here we have a meta-analysis again. Randomized controlled trials, low carb, less than 130 grams a day, or 26% of calories, and very low carb, less than 10. So this has got the low carb and the ketogenic, 18 studies, including 23 trials looking at hemoglobin A1C. Low carb diets were associated with a large 32% increase in remission. Well, it's not just that it worked and it did better. This is a greater percentage, 32% of remission. These people lost their diabetes. That is amazing. And so here's another systematic review done in 2013, 20 controlled trials, 3,000 individuals. And the conclusion was the low carb diet was as effective at low glycemic, Mediterranean, high protein, at improving various markers of glycemic index for people with diabetes. That's still amazing. This shows supporting studies for diabetes. Does the DASH diet work? These dark blue are randomized controlled trials. There's a few. Mediterranean diet, there's even more studies that show it works. Plant-based diet, there's some studies. And here's the low carb diet, a number of studies about the low carb diet supporting reduce risk and reduction in diabetes. 2018, carb restriction, controlling diabetes, a systematic review. Again, there was greater reduction in medicine. Really? Yeah, medicine. So when people went on these low carb diets, they could actually reduce their medications. That came as a surprise to me. This is fairly recent, 2018, when they're on the low carb diet. They can reduce the dosage of oral medication and or insulin. Really, when I started at this nutrition thing 40 years ago, this was not so. You gave people a whole bunch of carbohydrates to balance out the whole bunch of insulin you gave them, and we thought it was the best thing we could do. And now we found out, give people less of the carbohydrate, and then you need less of the insulin. A new idea over the past 5 years or so. And then some people actually saw the elimination of the medication. Again, Dietary carbohydrate, first approach to diabetes. Wow. Benefits of carb restriction in diabetes are immediate and well documented. And so now people are calling for the low carb diet to be the first approach in diabetes. And this is a joint message from the American Diabetes Association, the European Association for Diabetes, and they both have now listed low carb diet as one of the diets that can be prescribed for diabetes. That to me is really amazing in the last 5 years from what I used to tell people 20 years ago. And then a brief little bit about heart disease. You think if you eat all that fat, it's going to cause you to have heart disease. Well, the good HDL, it goes up on this. In a low-fat diet, it goes down. So the protective HDL goes up, and the LDL that goes up tends to be these big, fluffy ones that are not harmful. It's the small, dense ones that are harmful, and it doesn't change with this. Well, that's interesting. Triglycerides, fat in your blood. 19 controlled trials, there was a decrease of triglycerides by 29 milligrams. Very substantial decrease in fat in the blood, and lo and behold, the chances of you dying are less on this low-carb diet. Well, that's a benefit from the Framingham risk score. You can actually live. And if you're taking all this fat, doesn't it make saturated fat go up in your blood? Well, this is looking at the low-carb diet here. This is change in saturated fatty acids. In a low-carb diet, your saturated fat in your blood goes down more than on a low-fat diet. Cholesterol goes down more than on a low-fat diet. That's kind of amazing to me too. So the thing we thought was going to be dangerous with all of this high-fat diet was heart disease. Not so. This is just a jumble of things, but I just want to go through it briefly to show you no matter what parameter you are talking about with heart disease, the low-carb diet seems to be helpful. This is talking about very low carb. This is ketogenic compared to low fat. So body mass index goes down. So the orange here compared to the blue, it goes down more on ketogenic. Abdominal fat goes down. Triglycerides go down more. HDL goes up more than on a low-fat diet. We talked about triglycerides again, they go down. Small, dense go down on the low-carb diet. Glucose goes down, insulin goes down, insulin sensitivity, and then total saturated fatty acids go down. So we thought this has got to be bad for heart disease when you're taking all this fat in. Not so. The low-carb diet was effective for global improvement of all of these aspects of heart disease. So again, I want to thank my students for coming in here and helping me put all this stuff together. And we have one more we're going to talk about. So in this session, we're talking about the popular diets. We talked about the fasting, mostly intermittent fasting, now low carb keto. And the next one we're going to cover is going to be Mediterranean plant-based.